All of our viewing audience out there, welcome to the number 8 in our webinar series of supporting Strata through COVID-19. We are very thankful to have a special guest. We've often talked that the current situation requires a village solution. Well, I'm very happy to say that we've gone to the top. We've got the chief of the village. So the MP for Sydney, Alex Greenwich, welcome.
Thanks very much, Chris, and thanks very much for organising this webinar, and I hope everyone's doing okay.
Thank you. It's a good question to ask because out there in our Strata viewing world, we've got owners, we've got Strata managers, we've got Strata suppliers, and they're each impacted in their own way, some of them more significant than the others. So we're trying to support them with a series of resources and information and shared learning experiences that we can give. And this webinar is our most effective mechanism to get timely information out to them. So I do really appreciate the fact that we've been able to get someone such as yourself on for the afternoon. So thank you. For all those in attendance, the Q&A bar down below, please make sure, put any questions in there. I'll endeavour to get to them and put them to the member. If you also have a chat bar on the right-hand side, feel free to put any chats along the way. If I answer your questions, I might dismiss them as we go. Also, we've received some questions in advance, but I'm going to kick off with a few directly to you, Alex. And I guess the first is to cast your mind back a few weeks and your experience, particularly your experience as a Member of Parliament, in how COVID-19 sort of crept up on us and how it's now obviously, impacted every part of our life. But take me back to your own personal experience and then take me through what it's like being the MP for Sydney when COVID-19 pops up as such a topical issue.
Well, COVID-19 really really hit Sydney, I think, in early March, where it was clear that there was an increasing number of cases that had occurred, and quite clear that governments were going to need to take some pretty swift action. We had already seen the federal government put on a ban for flights coming in from mainland China. However, we soon found out that come March it was flights from Europe and the United States that were also bringing cases of COVID-19 to New South Wales. I don't think anybody expected the impact that it would have so swiftly. Maybe we should have, given what had happened in Wuhan. But the response from the New South Wales government was very much initially to treat this first and foremost as a health issue. And that was certainly the case also from the federal government largely. So making sure they were putting in place some emergency protocols. And as we have seen progressively over the past 3 weeks, the rules around social distancing, around self-isolation, around who needs to be isolating, have all sort of come into place. And obviously we're at the height of that now with some pretty strong health orders that really should limit our movement to just the essentials of going to work if you have to work and you can't work from home, going to buy essentials or going to exercise. Obviously, then we very much have shifted from addressing this as a health crisis to really dealing with this as an economic crisis. And we've seen all levels of government, local, state and federal, respond accordingly and increasingly to the situation we're in. I know that there will be probably people who are on this webinar who possibly themselves or friends or family members who have lost jobs, know of small business owners who are doing it really tough, and understand that there are so many people struggling economically as a result of the health crisis we're in. So we've now seen a number of these packages come into place. Most recently, yesterday, the federal government legislated the JobKeeper payment. There's a lot of information out there, and I know that people are almost struggling to sit through it. At the same time as constituents are adjusting to a new normal where we are largely at home, where we're not going out, where we are all under financial pressure given the current situation, and trying to navigate where the supports are. So I think it's been quite a confronting time for me as a Member of Parliament. My job, though, has been to make sure I'm disseminating information out to people as best as I can, supporting my community as best as I can. I have on my website, for example, a list of all the financial resources that have been made available at a local, state and federal level, which people can access easily, but also providing really one-on-one support to a number of constituents who are doing it really tough at the moment.
And I just excuse my daughter in the background. That's the virtues of working from home. So the wheels of government, how are they operating? Are they still, I mean, are you still sitting in Parliament? Are you still dealing with the norms of what you need to do as a member of Parliament? And then how does that translate out from a local, state and federal government level in terms of the sharing of information? And you said obviously this was a health crisis initially. We're now dealing with it obviously as an economic crisis. We need to move through, as you've alluded to the social, mental well-being sort of nurturing that's now required for any potential longer-term lockdown.
So New South Wales Parliament is currently not sitting. We had an emergency session of Parliament, which went for a day, where a number of laws passed through the lower house and the upper house. These were laws to do with things like allowing councils to meet remotely, so via teleconference, to provide funding through payroll tax to incentives to small businesses, to do things like allowing changing state industrial relation laws to allow people to access long service leave after 5 years, and also to delegate certain emergency powers to a variety of ministers in the middle of this crisis. The next sitting date is locked in for sometime in September, but I fully expect us to go back before then to deal with a number of other pieces of legislation, some that indeed relate to Strata and the ability to have meetings remotely as well, just as was dealt with by councils. But on a day-to-day basis, local members, although we're not in Parliament, are really active in our communities and in our constituencies. And I'm really grateful that the New South Wales government has really taken an open approach to dealing with members. So on any given day, I'll contact either ministers, their chief of staff or senior staff about a variety of concerns to try to get resolution. So the wheels of government are actually rolling extremely fast. And although Parliament may not be sitting, whether it's members of Parliament, ministers, or indeed our staff, are really working as hard as ever. And in really unprecedented territory, we're really dealing with a variety of people who can have very specific and very different concerns that we're dealing with. At a federal level, it's very similar. And the other thing really to stress is that all levels of government, whether they be local, state or federal, are working really closely with each other. So federal members will deal with a lot of income support related questions and a lot of immigration related questions. The federal members that cover my electorate are Dave Sharma in Wentworth and Tanya Plebisek in Sydney. And my office has been working really well to address the common concerns of our constituents with those federal members.
Can I ask, I mean, Alex, this sounds like an unprecedented level of collaboration across all spheres of government. Have you, in your experience and your time as an MP, ever had any level of collaboration on anywhere near this level?
Well, you know, I think often when we look at our federal parliament, we don't see a lot of collaboration going on there often. And so I've been impressed about the work that has happened at a federal level. When it comes to New South Wales Parliament, we do often collaborate quite well, and members across party lines have really good working relationships with each other, often established through our committee processes, but not to this level. I think that the foundations of members across the parliament working together has put us in a good place to address this crisis, and in many ways to sort of put partisanship aside and to focus on dealing with people who need it, and really addressing this first as a health crisis, but also very much as an economic crisis. I certainly have been grateful for really the emergency treatment that the government has given a number of concerns that I've raised with them and continue to raise with them.
I mean, there appears to be, and I'm dealing with, you know, very various levels of government from state, local and federal on a range of issues on behalf of the strata industry. And we're doing that with our counterparts around the country. And there appears to be very little politics at play and just a lot of getting on with solving the problem. So it's noticeable from the outside, which is a credit obviously to everyone. And that bipartisanship you mentioned hopefully is there for the benefit of all the citizens, you know, your electorate and the broader electorates of Australia. So it's creditable to all of you. So your community of City of Sydney, or not City of Sydney, but the Sydney electorate, clearly there's a high density strata population there. So many of your residents, many of your constituents are impacted in a way because they're within higher densities, they're living together, they're being pushed into situations that they weren't necessarily designed for in terms of the outputs on the buildings. Do you think that the issues affecting your electorate are obviously more pronounced or more nuanced based on the amount of high density living you have in your electorate?
I would say that my electorate is very different to a number of others. You know, potentially area MPs who cover areas like North Sydney, Chatswood, also probably the seat of Newtown, to the west of my electorate, are other high density areas, but we're probably the highest density place, with also some of the highest property values, and also one of the largest populations of people who are homeless. So we've got quite a diversity in this electorate. A lot of my questions to government have been, how do the public health orders apply to apartment communities? So for example, when the public health order came in that all gyms had to close, the question was, is that commercially operated gyms, or is that all gyms? Because if we're shutting commercially operated gyms, then there is going to be a huge burden on gyms in apartment communities. But it was then made clear that this also should include gyms in apartment communities. So that message was able to get across that those also needed to close. I think one of the big issues for this electorate has been for a lot of people who have commercial tenancies, who have some of the highest commercial or retail tenancy leases because of the high density traffic we're usually dealing with. Now that has all fallen off, but they still have those rent bills to pay. The government is obviously working on a package related to that. And then, you know, we've got a population of rough sleepers, and a lot of work has gone in from the Minister for Family and Community Services to make sure that rough sleepers are being housed in hotels or other forms of temporary accommodation with the supports around them that they need. You know, often a lot of members of Parliament and indeed some in the ministry do view New South Wales as a place where people live in a home and have a backyard. A lot of my time is reminding them that that's not the case for everyone. Some of us don't have a backyard. Some of us don't even have balconies. So it's important that when we are dealing with the public health orders and the impacts that they are having on people's movement, that they're really factoring that in to make sure that people know they can be comfortable to go for a walk in the park, to go get their groceries. The other thing I would also factor in is, because we are such a dense area, we're dealing with a higher volume of people, which requires a greater level of patience from people. You know, now we are dealing with queues to get into supermarkets, not only because of the amount of people who could be going, but because of the social distancing rules that Coles and Woolies and others have put in place. So we very much have a unique set of circumstances in Sydney. And a lot of my job has been to remind government that not everybody lives in houses. People live in apartments or other forms of dense housing. And it's going to be important that it is communicated what the rules are. I think people are understanding that there are rules in place. Critical is to have clarity.
And you've long been an advocate for Strata because of your awareness of a lot of the topical issues that impact Strata schemes more generally in your electorate. But you touched on that patience piece, and it's something that doesn't exist in legislation. It's very difficult to summarise, but we're asking obviously for our members, and particularly for residents in Strata, to exercise patience and a degree of flexibility, because as you said, we're in uncharted waters. We're dealing with very complex issues, and we don't necessarily have all the answers. And sometimes I know that's a sense of frustration for a lot of Strata residents when there is no particular piece of legislation to point to. So at the moment, we're working with the state government, and I know our counterparts around the country are working with their relevant authorities around how we either loosen a level of compliance or have a set of principles around best endeavours where compliance may be difficult to achieve. Now, I'm not going to draw you on whether you think we should or shouldn't comply with the law, but in terms of technical compliances and where we're doing best endeavours, but we're having a health priority, how do you think the state government in particular should view that level of technical compliance? And when I say that, I mean things like meetings compliance, some things under the Strata Act in terms of timeframes. They're very difficult to achieve in the context of the current situation.
Well, I think first I would just acknowledge that people in Strata are used to living with clear rules, clear bylaws, having meetings that set rules, and having people adhere to them. And when you live so closely to your neighbours, you kind of need that baseline of a clear understanding of what you can do and what you can't do. And people who live in apartments often appreciate that. But we are in uncharted and developing territory at the moment. And I think that the key priority has to be that duty of care and the health priority of someone. So, for example, I don't think there has been a public health order that has said there are limitations on the number of people who can go into a lift. But I don't know of any apartment buildings that haven't put in a limit of 2 people per lift, for example. There is also some lack of clarity around, if say gyms or some other public places are closed, what about common areas like shared patios or other places? What happens there? And I think a number of buildings have interpreted that as it's fine to access those areas just as long as you are demonstrating the social distancing, because critical is the health concern here. So I think that a lot of stratas are doing a good job. This is all taking time. For example, the building I live in, because I live in it and I get the public health orders, I'm able to send them across to the concierge and pass them on. My mum's building that she lives in the city, they've taken a bit longer to implement some things, but essentially the same things are being implemented, say in terms of closure of gyms and pools. So I think patience to understand, to allow people to understand what the public health orders are and how they apply to apartment communities is really important here. I have specifically asked the government to make it clear that when they do make a public health order and it is dealing with a public or a commercial space, should exactly the same order apply to strata or other dense communities? And it's important that we get that clarity from them. But until we have that, I think that the overriding priority should be putting in place the health principles, which are pretty clear, and they're there for a reason. They're there to make sure that people are not spreading COVID-19 and are not are limiting their ability to also contract COVID-19. So that's really what we're all seeking to achieve here. It's not about putting in place a police state. It's really about limiting the spread, so we can get this under control.
I mean, you're advocating a common sense approach, which is to prioritise health, but make sure we can continue with the business of strata as best we can. And you touched on a few issues earlier around, for example, commercial and retail tenancies, and I know that they're particularly vulnerable. And it's not just the rental, obviously, which is obviously an issue then for the landlord, but the landlords themselves, if they're forced to come up with alternative arrangements, and there is now a code, particularly a commercial tenancies code, where you need to come to a reasonable arrangement between the landlord and the tenant, and that often puts the landlord in a position where they may default then on their ability to pay strata levy. So the knock-on effect through our communities are significant, and that's why I think you mentioned that we were in that economic management perspective. Every time you do at a government level, and this is a question for you, every time you do give a stimulus package for one area, obviously there's knock-on effects because it might be treated inequitably in others. And I use that in terms of tenants being reflected with a number of protections, but landlords not afforded the same level of protection. So how do you continue to advocate for both to make sure that one isn't left behind there?
Yeah, that's a really important question. I think particularly 2 weeks ago when there was a lot of talk, when the Prime Minister made his announcement of a moratorium on evictions, and some of the political sphere were saying, that this means you won't be evicted for not paying your rent, basically then implying you don't have to pay your rent to your landlord. And that caused a great deal of concern because we're dealing with a whole system here. You've got renters, you've got the landlords, you've got the strata who will rely on the fees from the landlord or from the owner. You've got the bank who are often underwriting who have the mortgages, and it really has to have a whole of system approach. And things have been evolving. So you know, in terms of conversations, I know that a lot of people are having conversations with their landlords potentially about rent reduction or rent deferral, and how does that look, whether you're a commercial or a residential tenant. And I know a number of those conversations have been really productive, and tenants have been able to reach agreements with their landlords. Some haven't been, but we haven't yet got a legislated package. So we don't currently have in New South Wales yet the code of conduct around rental, either commercial or residential, with what the rights and responsibilities are of the various parties, and indeed what the incentives or what the conditions are. So one of the key mechanisms which is often talked about is land tax, and giving a land tax waiver or an exemption on the basis that that is then passed on to a tenant. Now, in a lot of apartment buildings, owners won't be paying land tax. So how does that incentive, you know, what incentives do people in apartments then apartment owners can use? The banks have said they will defer mortgages and mortgage payments for up to 6 months. That mortgage still then needs to be paid. So I know a lot of the conversations have more been about deferring rent for a certain period of time, just as the landlord is deferring their mortgage payment, perhaps. But we are going to get a clear code of conduct here, and we are going to get a process for finding mediation. And we are going to be living in an environment where rents are obviously going to go down a little bit, just because of market conditions. And so, you know, landlords will want to retain their tenants potentially by reducing rent. But this is an emerging space. I expect New South Wales Parliament to probably come back in the next fortnight to deal with legislation around both commercial and residential tenancies, what the new rules, responsibilities and incentives are, to make sure that everybody is given some level of protection, and that no one party has to bear the full burden here.
So just going back to a few of those more particular challenges, one that has popped up many times in our pre-question poll, and also a few of the questions on the Q&A, is specifically around fire inspection. So I mentioned the challenges of some of the business's usual practices of Strata, and one of those is gaining access, particularly when you need to do an inspection within an apartment, whether it be for a fire protection device, a smoke detector, some other form of passive fire. Obviously, clearly, there are people who are restricting access for very good health reasons, i.e. they're in isolation, or they may well have contracted COVID-19 themselves, or from some sort of preventative mechanism. So have you given thought to how we balance that challenge of meeting compliance still, and the statutory compliance that exists for owners' corporations to preserve life safety, and obviously being sympathetic to the fact that some residents are not granting that access?
Look, I think this is certainly one that we need to make sure we are watching. Obviously, there is a responsibility and a liability that these fire inspections need to happen, and on that regular basis, and that's first and foremost for people's public safety. Then we do know that people can be you can be dealing with two cohorts here. You can either be dealing with someone who is in imposed isolation because they either have contracted COVID-19, or they've just returned from overseas, or fall into one of the other categories where you have to do self-isolation. And then you've got people like my mum, who's over 70, and she's decided that she doesn't want anyone coming into her apartment until this whole thing is cleared up, and there's greater understanding of the current situation. So we've really got to work this. We've really got to work this out and watch this one. And it could be that, you know, we do proceed with fire inspections, but there is a new health protocol around that, around making sure that the person in the apartment has personal protective equipment, making sure the people doing the inspection also have that equipment, looking at the time of day, the amount of people who are involved, etc. So this is probably an area where we're going to need to develop a new set of rules and guidelines to deal with this emerging situation. Yeah,
look, I couldn't agree more. I mean, from our member feedback, this particular issue is a hot button topic. It continually pops up, and that's because of the conflicting health obligations. One of those people protecting their health around contracting or obviously spreading COVID-19, and on the other side, the fire safety health risk, and the two of them are somewhat conflicting. I know a number of councils are providing extension opportunities for annual fire safety statements to provide that level of flexibility. But if we could work on something, and I know that you will go back and talk to your state colleagues, one would be getting some clarity about how we can get all the councils working on a similar sort of pattern there, so we're not doing things in a piecemeal fashion. So talking about those issues, Alex, defects, cladding, the Building Commissioner's agenda about restoring confidence back into the strata sector, that hasn't gone away. In fact, you could argue that those issues are even more important, particularly now that we've got more concentration of people in strata. So do we continue pushing on with those agendas at the same time? And I'm also mindful of the fact that there are only so many resources that can be applied to managing these, and they all appear to be focused, rightly so, around the health priorities of COVID-19.
So these continue to be major priorities. I mean, we can't we can't forget the concern and the crisis around a number of defects that really came to the forefront with the Opal Tower at the beginning of last year, and those concerns still exist. In Parliament, we were dealing with the Building Design Practitioners Bill. That bill is stalled in the upper house. The upper house is currently not sitting. What spun off of that was a process for registration of engineers as well, not only for buildings, but engineers broadly. The government then established an inquiry, which I chaired, and we're just finalising our report on that. But there were obviously a number of important protections in that bill. Some of them were indeed retrospective. Important protections around duty of care, important protections around private certification. We also know that it was flagged by the Minister that the Building Commissioner was going to have new legislated powers to be able to be doing investigations in buildings where there were concerns. That work needs to continue. And so in terms of the outstanding legislation, I do hope that is something we can address and legislate before September, which is the next sitting date, and I hope we do go back then. And I guess when it comes to cladding and a few other issues around building defects, there's another concern here, which is buildings meeting and having to raise special levies to be able to pay for this work at a time when a number of people are experiencing financial hardship. And what provisions are being put in place there in terms of, again, looking at this as a whole spectrum, what work can be done, say, from utilities companies to allow strata's deferral of payments for bills to do with utilities like electricity. What can insurance companies do? Because I know the insurance can be a really large cost for a lot of stratas, and what deferment can happen there to deal with the potential financial burden. And how can we address this issue of financial hardship when there are special levies that do not cripple an owner's corporation from being put in that really uncomfortable spot of having to comply with an order, having lot owners who are struggling to pay their special levy. What do you do then? So this is something that I've raised directly with Minister Anderson's office, and I know that they're looking into a set of principles and processes around how do you deal with financial hardship and how do you deal with issues such as special levies and impacts on people who may not be able to pay them immediately.
Yeah. Oh, look, I can tell you from personal experience that the Building Commissioner is most definitely continuing on at a very fast pace. He's still continuing with all of his meetings that he had prior to the implementation of, or the impact of COVID-19. And I'm very buoyed by the fact that his desire to obviously restore confidence is going to continue. The challenges that you've identified, though, are the conflicting financial capacity of owners who still may have to pay for things that to do with defects, and particularly cladding. And one thing that obviously, that SCA has been lobbying for was government support in some level around supporting owners who are impacted by defects and cladding in particular. Now, that's a challenging financial request to have at present as we've been burdened by a lot of other support challenges for the economy. But it's something that we don't want to lose sight of, and probably becomes more focused when we talk about the vulnerability of owners when they do get caught with a fire order at this point, and they have obviously limited capacity in their own economic life to pay for things. Have you heard of stories in your electorate around waste capacity? So we obviously have a lot of people living on top of each other. The waste system's only designed to accommodate so many people. Is that an emerging issue, particularly within the Sydney electorate?
It really is. And I know this is something that is top of mind for the City of Sydney, for the Lord Mayor, Clover Moore, and for the CEO, Monica Baroni. People are home more. People are doing a lot. I was having a conversation with the city where people, because they're home, they are doing a lot of spring cleaning and finding a lot of stuff that they want to throw out. And a lot of people are doing that all at the same time. So we are dealing with quite a large amount of waste occurring, and some large waste. The area I live in, Darlinghurst, Potts Point, if you go around here, you will see beds and couches on footpaths, people, cupboards and books. The city is doing a really good job of being as proactive as they can. When people like me call them and say, why is this a whole bunch of furniture on the street corner, and coming and picking it up, removing it and cleansing the area. On top of that, we also have a waste from the fact that a lot of people are wanting to support local restaurants and bars and ordering food delivery and takeaway, and probably have more takeaway containers than they usually would. So this is going to require, again, everybody to participate in this process. So obviously the city is committed to increasing their cleaning and waste removal. I think it would probably be appropriate for buildings to, time when people are doing their spring cleaning. So not everybody's doing it all at once, and sort of the waste disposal rooms aren't full with a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, it is going to just require that increase in pickup and waste removal. And I know that, for example, the City of Sydney is really committed to that.
So one of the issues that's popped up on our chat, Alex, which is a very real issue, is that now that we have all these people working at home, it's an opportune time, obviously, to get some of the external works done, particularly where social isolating is potentially not an issue for remedial works when you're outside, you're scaffolding, you're on your own. But they're coming up against the challenge of people working from home who don't want the repairs and the noise and the scaffolding impacting their work from home. It's hard enough having children running around, let alone having a jackhammer on your doorstep. So you could see the conflicts that exist. And our advice is that the ecosystem of Strata needs to continue. And it's more important now than ever that we continue to normalise the repairs and maintenance. And in some ways, if you can afford it, to bring forward some of those repair works to a time where you can actually have access provided, you can actually do things where those parts of the workforce who are essential workers can access a building and still self-isolate. So you can see that every corner you turn, there's another conflicting challenge. So it does present such an unprecedented level of challenge for us that every time we think we've got a solution, there's something else that pops up. So talking about the financial capacity there, I want to talk a little bit more about Airbnb, which I know, particularly in your electorate, pops up as a very topical issue. Now, we saw more recently the state government come out with a number of very strong statements in terms of their perspective on the legality, and they've obviously then softened that into what they think is more of an interpretation around the legality of travelling, not so much about the platforms themselves being illegal. But what's your perspective, obviously, on the current approach to short-term letting? And I use Airbnb because they become the proxy for platforms because of their ubiquitous nature across the world. So one, what's your view on the approach to short-term platforms in the current environment? And two, the introduction of laws to start tomorrow, which enable strata buildings to be able to make laws to limit, in some cases, short-term letting.
Well, obviously, following the legislation around short-term letting, we've been left in a quite a grey area for a very long time, waiting for the planning controls and waiting for the code of conduct to come into place. This has impacted councils' abilities to do enforcement, and has just had a lack of clarity out there about whether you can outright ban short-term letting or not. How you deal with complaints, etc. So this has been a huge issue. It continues to be a huge issue within my electorate. And in any given week, we'll deal with multiple buildings who have real concerns here. And it could be from tenants who are subletting their properties through Airbnb, and then the landlord needs to kick that tenant out who's subletting it. Or it could be from just general abuse and apartment communities turning into hotels because it's been overrun. So what we do know is from tomorrow, Stratas can move to outlaw short-term letting in places where it is not the principal residence of the owner. There does potentially need to be some regulatory or legislative change to properly facilitate a strata to be able to have the meeting to do that. And I know you and I spoke about how that can be done potentially through a proxy working with your strata manager. But often these are conversations where I know apartment communities will want to have a proper discussion about setting the new rules in the guidelines that they have. It is unfortunate that we don't have the code of conduct and that we don't have sort of the clear enforcement regime. My understanding is that was considered to be a bit too much of an impost at this time. However, what we do know is that the enforcer in the space of short-term letting, now if people are concerned that either people are travelling in from out of area or having multiple people over for a party, that is now a legal activity, that breaches a bylaw, and the enforcer in that case is certainly the police. So if people are seeing this sort of activity occurring in their building, then they should call the police, and the police are there to enforce it with very clear rules under the public health orders that have been issued. I do know from talking to Minister Anderson's office that they are committed to the code of conduct, that they are continuing to work on that, and hopefully we have that in place by mid-year, the very latest. I've also spoken to the Planning Minister's office about the SEP and when that will be put in place. And in this time where we don't have the SEP and the changes to make short-term letting exempt development, what controls are in place to allow councils to do enforcement? Because a number of councils had concern that while we didn't have the clear code of conduct, that there could be difficult processes in getting some convictions through court processes. So this has been a grey area for a very long time, and that's caused a lot of distress to a number of buildings. It has slightly been tightened by the fact that we can now meet to put in these bans. And indeed, in the current situation of COVID-19, in terms of activity that you might previously have called the council or fair trading about because it was an annoyance or affected your amenity, it's now a police issue.
Look, and I think you touched on a very salient point there. So I think the challenge at the moment is if you've got a clear mandate from your owners corporation and you can facilitate a meeting other than in person, then there's nothing stopping you implementing after tomorrow a special resolution to put in place a bylaw to limit short-term renting. And there will be many buildings that take that opportunity up. If you wish, however, to have a broader democratic meeting and actually discuss with your owners, and you don't have either the means to have that electronically, or you want to have a discussion with people in person, then you can defer that so that you can actually conduct a meeting at a point in time. But there are mechanisms, and you should consult with your strata manager or a strata expert around how to convene a meeting, even if you haven't passed a resolution that provides meetings by any other means. Because as you touched on, you can have proxy meetings, you can do things. So where there is a will, there is a way. And I think at the moment there's a lot of misinformation, particularly around platforms in the marketplace, and we need to get the right advice and make sure that owners corporations are making the right advice on the right level of consideration. So I'm sure we haven't heard the end of that, because short-term letting, particularly in your electorate, will continue to be an issue. And I think when the code is introduced, we'll have a little bit more clarity. So we're all welcoming that.
And I think an important point here is I'm sure people have seen that there has actually been a decrease in short-term letting, because there has been a clear decrease in tourism that has occurred. As a result, a number of people are turning what was previously their property, which they short-term let, into a property that they're now renting out. And that is resulting in some cases in the cost of rents decreasing in certain types of apartments. Now, will that last forever? Probably not. So it's important that once we're over this COVID-19 period, that we do have those clear rules in place, because we don't want suddenly a laissez-faire approach to be adopted. We want to make sure that by that point there are clear rules, that there is a clear registration system in place for short-term letting, and that there is clarity around the planning controls and how, for example, the exempt development interacts with the building, who has it as a consent condition that they don't have short-term letting allowed in their building. So there's a number of things which government needs to be giving clear guidance on, and now's the time to sort that out before we see an upsurge in short-term letting.
Yeah. So a more technical point, and it was raised in our Q&A, is the state parliament capable of meeting electronically by phone or other means in the current situation to deal with pressing legislation?
In terms of passing legislation, the Parliament can sit at the discretion of the Speaker at any time, but we have to meet in person. There are clear standing orders in place about that. I know that the Speaker, Jonathan O'Dea, has written an op-ed in the Herald where he has talked about how we can have a virtual Parliament going forward. That would probably require some quite substantial changes to the rules that manage the Parliament. What is currently happening, though, is the committee process is still certainly ongoing. As I said, that the committee which I'm chairing in terms of the registration of engineers bill is coming closely towards having some recommendations and our report, and a number of other committees can meet, and committees can meet over phone and teleconference. The Parliament itself can't. Currently, when we did sit, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, we about half the Parliament sat, so that the parties basically halved their numbers, and so it was very much a reduced Parliament that was sitting. But no, currently we cannot meet virtually. But I also do want to assure people that, although we're not sitting in Parliament, a number of members are probably working longer hours than ever before. Ministerial staff are working harder than ever before, as well as parliamentarians. We're also local members who have responsibility to our local area. And at a time of crisis, it's important that we're dealing with and addressing those concerns as quickly as we can.
No, I accept that, and maybe it's time for a progressive parliamentarian to introduce some innovation in terms of the way Parliament sits, because there's no time like the present to innovate. So
sure,
I'll leave that one with you. So in terms of on the ground stories, are you hearing? We all like to hear the good stories. Occasionally we hear the bad, but are you hearing the kind of stories that give you confidence that as a community we're pulling together? And conversely, you're hearing those stories that sadden you around the way our behaviours as a community probably don't stand up to the values that we'd like to see?
Well, I have seen in a number of buildings, in cases where people have had to be in full quarantine mode, neighbours helping them out, bringing them food, bringing them essentials, building managers or concierges looking after the more elderly people in buildings who don't want to go outside. I had a really a local small bar came to me when bars were about to be shut by the New South Wales government, and said, well, can we change regulations to allow us to do delivery and takeaway so we can keep people employed and keep our businesses running? And the government agreed to that regulatory change. So people, in apartments can now have cocktails delivered to their door, which may be something people want to do on the Thursday going into the long weekend. And my website actually has a list of restaurants and bars that are doing delivery and takeaway of food and beverages. So there have been a lot of really good stories. Then there have been a lot of stories of adjustment, and you sort of touched on this when you were talking about work. So, a lot of people who could be renovating their apartment were planning to do that during the day, where they knew that a lot of the other residents were at work, but suddenly we're all working from home. And so, you know, spreading those works out, and working with an apartment community as a whole to make sure that there isn't a large noise impact at any one time. That kind of stuff can be important. Obviously, there have been stories where, you know, you have heard of people you know, having large parties and large gatherings. Often in those situations, the police have been called and people have received those $1,000 fines. But largely, you know, Sydney-siders are pretty good people. And people have really stuck to the rules, supported each other, and looked out for each other. Other important stuff that I've heard is really, you know, just making sure you're calling friends, family members, and neighbours and checking on them. People deal with the kind of isolation that we're all having to face in very different ways. Some people thrive on it. Other people really struggle with it.
Oh, look, and I think you're exactly right in that the sense of community, and at the start here, obviously, I said that it's going to take a village solution, and that's what we've been advocating to our members, and many of our members and the participants out there who are listening today are the leaders in their communities, whether they be strata managers, service providers, or the very influential people who do the heavy lifting on committees, and they get their responsibility, and I think they're buoyed by the fact that they see that such leadership coming from yourself gives them confidence that they can continue to lead their communities through. I could only imagine your office would be receiving many requests for clarity on issues. So, and in many cases, you wouldn't have the answer, because I know that because some of these questions don't have answers. Are you fielding constantly questions from people, particularly your electorate, around how to interpret the laws? And how challenging is that to give your frontline staff and yourself the tools to be able to answer those questions?
Well, I think it's probably good to start with where the process all begins with all these new rules that are being put in place, and that is National Cabinet meets. So National Cabinet is made up of the Chief Ministers of Territories, the Premiers of States, and the Prime Minister. They set a group of principles that then it's up to the state and territory governments to then interpret in either state law or by passing emergency orders or public health orders. Largely in New South Wales, a lot of it has been done through public health orders. Now, we are also working at a very fast pace to be able to put in these restrictions to make sure that we are stopping the spread and you know, as they keep on saying, flattening the curve. That means that staff and parliamentary council and departmental officers are having to work in a very rapid pace, and in some cases, you know, will be leaving some stuff out or will not be providing the full clarity that they can in the rush in which we are putting these rules in place. So then when it comes down to an MP or an electorate officer, we're dealing with interpretation questions all the time. And as I sort of flagged at the start of the webinar, pools and gyms in apartment communities was a really clear example of that. It wasn't clear, and to some point, it may not be 100% clear yet. So I've asked for clarity around that to make sure that when a public health order is talking about a public space or a commercial space, that can we also make sure that we're talking about common or shared areas in other types of buildings and entities. But what I have really been grateful for is the responsiveness of particularly of the Health Minister's office to help us get clarity on a number of issues, and being able to feed that back specifically to constituents.
I mean, as you're aware, we're working with the state government and Fair Trading, and also as at Monday night, City of Sydney passed a resolution to write to all the various ministers to ask for a definitive set of guidelines now that we expect a longer term lockdown to be a more normalised management structure. And we're very buoyed by the fact that SCA was mentioned specifically as an authoritative body. And we're obviously very pleased to continue working with any state or local government authority to be able to develop that. What do you think is the government's role in terms of being that single source of truth? And I say that because I understand the challenges of providing such varied advice across a very large portfolio such as Fair Trading. what is government's role, and what role do you think that associations such as ours and others who can contribute to the discussion can provide, particularly when we need information in a very timely manner in a fluid, changing landscape?
Well, I think that the role of government here is to provide clear direction, and to work with key stakeholders. I mean, people will be relying on their buildings committees to set rules. Building committees will be relying on strata managers to be able to give them advice and guidance. Strata managers will be relying on big bodies like SCA to give them guidance and support as well. And I know that you are certainly doing that. The government has to be there to make sure that they're giving clear direction, and that they are working with supporting and I would also say funding work that is being done, and making sure that it is being done accurately. People are wanting answers. And it's not that the clear message which I constantly am making to government is no one is challenging the public health orders. We are all accepting that these new rules are in place. We just want to know how you interpret them in this situation, and giving that clarity, and realizing that there can be a lot of work here. But if someone like SCA is doing that work, the government has an important role to say, yes, this is completely accurate. This follows the guidance of the public health order. We fully support it and endorse that, because it's proven that it is impossible for government to be able to capture every single aspect of every single industry that happens in New South Wales. But in dealing with peak or community associations, they're able to help disseminate that instructions a lot faster and in a lot more tailored and specific ways to their specific area. And as I said, I know that a lot of people on this webinar would feel the frustration that a lot of the instructions that have been given in the context that New South Wales is a suburban area where people have a home, a front yard and a backyard. And a lot of the guidance has not been presented in the context of people live in apartment buildings, they share lifts, common areas, in sometimes very tight spaces. How do we deal with that? What are the rules and guidelines in place here? That has certainly been a bit of a gap in my view. I do know that Health and Fair Trading are working on it, and I know that you're working with them as well. So hopefully, in the not too distant future, we have these kind of clear guidelines and expectations. But at the same time, I think we also have talked about patience. This whole situation is 3 weeks in the making, and it's hard to touch every single type of industry in that period of time.
No, and I think everyone who is watching today, and I know myself personally, is very much encouraged the fact that you, one, understand Strata, and two, have such an investment in making sure that you advocate on behalf of higher density living, because the challenges faced by Strata living in the face of a longer, more prolonged lockdown are significantly amplified. And we get that, and we're obviously very thankful that you fully appreciate that transition between health to economic to what we call management instead of business unusual type strategies to occur, hopefully to assist our members as we go longer into a prolonged lockdown. And I think we've finished all of our Q&A there, and on behalf of Strata Community Association, Alex, I'm very thankful for your time on an Easter Thursday before a long weekend. I'm not sure if you've got plans. I hope you don't. Obviously the lockdown laws mean that we'll all be staying in place, but we certainly appreciate your advocating on behalf of Strata. I know you've done that for many, many years outside of this. SCA certainly appreciates you and all the work you do on behalf of Strata residents and your interface with government. And once again, thank you for your time. Thank you on behalf of Strata, and we look forward to hearing from you in the future.
Thank you very much, and I hope everyone has a good weekend and indeed does stay home. Hopefully not everybody in people's buildings does that big clean out this weekend, because that'll put a big impost on waste removal. And the clear message this weekend is stay home and eat Easter eggs. Don't travel anywhere.
That's right. Well, thank you very much to all of our viewers out there. Thank you again. We'll put this up on our website. As always, stay safe. Alex, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone.